have another take on this injury about the plants.
It is quite interesting that plants have this incredible capacity to turn obstacles in their path or things that potentially harm them into something that can actually further their ends and that can work to their advantage. And I think it is worth approaching this issue through the dialectical logic that is developed to a certain extent in Hegel's philosophy of nature. And so as he brings his discussion of plants in the philosophy of nature to a close, Hegel suggests that the formation of fruit results from a destructive process, in his words. So the very positive element of fruit formation results from a destructive process. One of the theses supporting his suggestion is that, in his words, the ripening of the fruit is also its downfall, for injury to the fruit assists its ripening, end quote. Hegel's observation reveals yet again how plants turn adversity into advantage, a presumably negative condition into a positive precondition for thriving. I say yet again because we can also see how the loss of bodily extension and pruning can actually be transformed into plenitude, or can transform lack into plenitude, seeing that pruned bushes can proliferate and flourish much faster and more luxuriantly and exuberantly than ever before. Instead of actively opposing or passively succumbing to a threat, plants incorporate it into their own constitution and life process, making the most out of it. Now, I want us to note the difference between the dialectical insight of Hegel and Nietzsche's lesson from what he calls life's school of war, long since adopted as a piece of folk wisdom. And what Nietzsche says is that whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? So what is the difference between this ripening injury in Hegel and Nietzsche's words? Here, demise and enhanced survival are still at odds with one another, whereas in Hegel's line of reasoning, whatever damages the fruit speeds up its journey towards success. So this injury and success are not two contrary or contradictory things, but in fact, they can work by supporting one another. Rather than blocking the potentialities of an injured being, the injury does the work of time itself, letting fruit ripen before its appointed time. It is not evading danger and boosting the chances of a fruit, but on the contrary, getting in harm's way. This is what I call ripening violence. Now, in the course of ripening, a fruit attains its identity, its color, size, flavor, and other characteristics that differentiate it from the initial and rather homogenized state of greenness, smallness, sourness, shared by all fruit regardless of distinctions among species, right? So ripening gives the fruit its distinct characteristics. Seen through a dialectical prism, mechanical or insect-induced injury as a catalyst for ripening is the agent of determinate negation, that is, of a negation which determines the thing it negates, actually dispensing to that thing what is most proper to it. Okay? The plant-based phenomenon of ripening violence appears both as the exemplary encapsulation, or in Hegel speak, a concrete universality of creative negativity, and a fleshing out that actualizes being itself. It would be interesting in a future project to consider the parallels between this ripening injury and the kinds of negative events that can bring a certain maturity or ripeness to animals and humans as well. And so we can think, for instance, about disease in humans and animals as individuating, and that would be the take not so much of Hegel as of Novalis, who thinks precisely that plants are diseased stones and animals are diseased plants and humans are diseased animals, and therefore humans at the top of this presumed hierarchy incorporate or embody in themselves all other kinds of pathology or disease, animal, vegetal, and mineral. So there is a kind of individuation from this pathological state compared to the other form of existence. There is an individuation of another kind of being going on that parallels the ripening violence that I'm talking about. But we can also then finally think about collective or supra-individual human realities in relation to ripening violence. And here I am reminded of a term that Gayatri Spivak has used for decades now, and precisely her term is enabling violence in relation to colonialism, because she recognizes, for instance, that British colonialism in India was obviously a violent event, but it produced what she calls an enabling violence of giving a certain language, a common language, to the colonized and later post-colonial subject, and giving a certain frame of education as well that could, and despite the violent imposition, empower these subjects. For instance, by imposing the English language on colonized subjects around all over the British Empire, it created the conditions of possibility for solidarity and communication, basic linguistic communication among the different colonized and later post-colonial subjects. So I see this kind of invocation of enabling violence in colonialism and post-colonialism as still ringing the bells of the ripening injury that Hegel is talking about in relation to plants.
How do you relate that to Chernobyl? Because you wrote this text on Anna Chernobyl Herbarium, and one of the sentences that really struck me in this text that you wrote was that what we call the exclusion zone is the zone where actually we are excluding ourselves from nature. Mm-hmm. And it was really a revelation for me, this sentence, because we tend to think, which is true, that we have damaged the environment, that we have damaged the flora and fauna that live in Chernobyl environment, but actually we have damaged ourselves first and foremost, and we have removed ourselves from this part of the world where now fauna and flora are blossoming, maybe with some modification. Do you relate this to this injury and violence
Yes.
that just developed?
Yes, I think that the event of Chernobyl is intimately related to injury and violence. In fact, I call it in the Chernobyl Herbarium a trauma that is a trauma of personal, but also of environmental and even planetary proportions. And perhaps this term trauma ties together the different threads of what we have been talking about today, but in a negative way, because a traumatic experience is an experience from which one cannot learn by definition. It is an experience of a present that does not pass, that keeps its oppressive weight on us, and that looms large to such an extent that it even covers over the horizons of the future. So by failing to become the past, a trauma also robs the future from us because it is not passing and not freeing up time and space for the future. In that sense, we cannot learn anything from a traumatic experience, and it can also not be the enabling kind of violence that we're talking about here. Here, I would want to think about it as a kind of pure negativity that is influencing everything and everyone to such an extent that there is no way to surpass, overcome, modify oneself, and really get over it in a sense. There a lot of work of mourning in the psychoanalytic sense of mourning needs to be done in order to work through trauma and to transform it into an event that can be commemorated, remembered, and therefore somehow resolved at the level of psychic and other levels of life. But at the same time, I want to also talk about this exclusion zone and its generalization to the rest of the world. So when we say the word Chernobyl, we think about a specific geographical location and the specific time frame of 1986 when the nuclear accident happened. To say, as I claimed in Chernobyl Herbarium, that the singular proper name Chernobyl is also a name for a trauma of planetary proportions, means that the repercussions and implications of this event go much beyond the immediate surroundings of Chernobyl, the 30-kilometer exclusion zone around it, to such an extent that the entire planet is becoming an exclusion zone. And this is where some of my recent work has been going, in this particular direction. So when I talk about dump philosophy and the transformation of the world into a dump, I basically outline the kind of situation in which we are now, where what we call environmental pollution is no longer an exception to the rule of a pristine environment. It is not like we have pockets, limited pockets of environmental pollution in the sea of normalcy and pristine nature. Quite the contrary. This kind of highly polluted environment has become a norm, and what we are seeking are these exceptional pockets of more or less breathable air, of relatively clean water that are harder and harder to find, even in the most remote of areas on the planet. So I see here a kind of change of paradigm that Chernobyl perhaps heralded or presaged, in a sense, where from an exceptional event, an exceptional eruption of a certain negative consequence of human technologies, we are moving to the regime, the normalized and generalized regime of this kind of large-scale, massive pollution and dumpification of the world, in which there are fewer and fewer exceptional livable places.